Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is the last video in the natural versus enhanced series. If you have missed the first three ones, the links will be in the description down below. What we covered in the first one was the science behind the differences between natural and enhanced. In this video, I will cover some recommendations, general recommendations for enhanced lifters, especially interesting when it comes to when you decide to go off of the products, okay? You can see that I have changed the setup here. I'm in my home gym. Some people were complaining about the lighting, but the problem with this lighting here is I look at least 20 years older because of the light. Anyway, let's get started. All right, recommendations for the enhanced lifters. By the way, if you have not done so already, make sure to subscribe to the channel. That really helps me out, because really the next step would be for me to open an OnlyFans account. And I'm not sure if I want to do that for my own credibility, but it might come to that. Also, if you can like the video, that would be greatly appreciated. And also hit that bell thingy, because that will make sure you will get an advance notice every time I post a new video, and I plan to post a lot of new content in the future. All right, recommendation for the enhanced lifter. To me, that's a topic you really don't see a lot. First, because, well, people don't want to talk about the topic because they fear that it might paint them as a drug addict or a druggie or a steroid user. Me, I see it as, you know what, if you have made a decision of going that way, might as well not screw yourself up in the process, right? So to me, it's an ethical choice of trying to help you out with the knowledge I have. I'm not a doctor, but I have some knowledge and experience, so I might want to make you benefit from that. Okay, make sure that you watch the first video of natural versus enhanced training. Yes, it's long, it's a full webinar, but it explains the differences between both types of lifter. Now, some points I want to make sure that we understand before we get started with the actual recommendation. First, while you are on cycle, steroids can counterbalance, and sometimes a lot more, the elevation of cortisol. That might be a problem with natural lifters, especially at the muscle level. Steroids will not be able to completely block the impact of cortisol on the brain, the heart, and whatnot. And when I say cortisol, understand that if you watch the first video, it's cortisol and adrenaline, because both are connected together. Most of the side effect when it comes to health of cortisol will come from the increase in adrenaline that leads from that comes with the increase in cortisol. Now, but from the muscle perspective, anabolic steroids, because they are so strong anabolic and normally used in very high dosages compared to what the amount of cortisol the body produces, can more than counterbalance from an elevation in cortisol that could come from an excess in training. So basically, and that's one point I want to make in the first recommendation, is that really a steroid user should actually train a lot more like a natural lifter. The opposite is not true. Because what will work for a natural will be great for an enhanced lifter. But what the steroids will do to you is they actually allow you to get away with more. Okay, or sometimes that would be training mistakes for a beginner, because physiologically speaking, the body will be able to stay anabolic even in situation where it normally would become catabolic if it were natural, right? Steroids can also improve neurological factors or impact neurological factor by acting on several neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are essentially hormones that affect the brain or released by the brain. Now, most notably, for example, a lot of steroids will directly activate the dopamine and serotonin receptors, which is in part responsible for the fact that these products can actually become truly addictive. Not addicted to the gains, but the substances themselves can actually be addictive, because dopamine is the pleasure center of the brain. So the steroids can actually trigger those dopamine receptors, giving you a pleasure response, kind of like a cigarette, for example, and that can become addictive. And a lot of depression that comes from the post-cycle period can come from the fact that you over-stimulated dopamine receptors, making them resistant to a normal level of dopamine. Okay, just like when you stop taking cigarettes, nicotine strongly stimulate the dopamine receptors. That's why it's addictive. So when you stop taking the cigarette, you don't get the same dopamine activation, pleasure response. That's why it's hard to stop, and that's why you oftentimes will start craving food. The reason why you're craving food when you stop smoking is not because you want to have something in your mouth. It's because subconsciously your brain needs that pleasure response, and it will ask you to give it the food that gives you pleasure to try to mimic the dopamine response you got from the dopamine from the cigarette. And that's actually why the nicotine gum and patches can work to some extent, because they do provide a smaller but still there dopamine stimulation, helping you cope with the deprivation. Same thing can happen with serotonin. Serotonin is also, receptors are strongly stimulated by some steroids, and when you stop, then you can actually have a dysfunctional serotoninergic system, leading to problems sleeping, anxiety, adaptation problems. We will cover all of that further down the road, but this is just an introduction. Furthermore, steroids will increase the sensitivity to adrenaline, so you respond more strongly to adrenaline, which is one of the reasons why you see so many bodybuilders being also really into those recreational drugs like amphetamine, speed, ecstasy, and stuff like that, because you actually are more sensitive to those products. Same thing, you can become addicted to clenbuterol, to ephedrine, because you are more sensitive to these drugs, because steroids increase the sensitivity of the receptors interacting with adrenaline. Finally, you can have a decrease in GABA with some steroids, most knowingly Boldenone or equipoise. It will lower GABA or GABA activity, leading to higher anxiety and also harder to control hunger and fluctuation in blood sugar levels. Anyway, that's supposed to be the introduction, and it's way too long already. Now, that's why, for example, just to finish the topic here, that's why while you are on cycle, you feel more confident, more assertive. Your self-esteem is higher, you're more motivated, you can even be happier and feel better, all because your brain chemistry will be strongly affected by those chemicals. You can also adapt better to some stimulation and be less impacted by stressful situation, again, because of those neurotransmitter effect. However, when you stop your cycle, most of the bad feeling that happens, people think it's because I have less androgen in my body, so my libido goes down, my assertivity goes down, my confidence goes down, my aggressiveness goes down. Well, yeah, but the main reason is mostly because the chemicals you use actually desensitize several of your systems. Dopaminergic system, serotonergic system, leading to less pleasure in life, less motivation, less drive, and less sexual desires. Of course, the lower level of androgen from your natural testosterone inhibition plays a role, but to me, neurotransmitters are actually much more to blame for those. So that's why you have bodybuilders who can fully recover their testosterone levels after a cycle, yet their libido is still down the drain. They're still anxious and depressive. It's because fixing those neurotransmitter issues can last a lot longer than the actual on period. More on that later. So let's get on with the recommendations. First recommendation, an enhanced lifter can get away. Doesn't mean he needs to do more, but he can get away with more training stress. But what is optimal for a natural will still work very well for enhanced lifter, because steroids not only increase your recovery capacity, both neurologically and physiologically, they increase the adaptations you get from a certain stimulus. The reason is because they increase protein synthesis to such a high level and maintain that anabolism as long as the drug is in your system. So it magnifies the gain from a workout. Now, I'm just going to throw a number around, and they're not accurate. It's just for illustration purposes. So maybe a natural can progress 1% from a workout. Well, an enhanced lifter from the same workout might progress by 2 or 3%. And when you pile that up over months, it can count. So you don't even need to change the training that a natural would do when you are enhanced. So personally, what I recommend is always starting where natural lifters should start. And from that point on, you might want to titrate training stress up slightly if you need to or if you want to, but you don't actually have to, because there's plenty of example of enhanced and even grossly enhanced lifters making amazing progress from training programs that would be typically ideal for natural lifters. Good example being fortitude training by Dr. Scott Stevenson, which is one of the best training approach I know. I mean, I highly recommend the book. I highly recommend the training program, especially if you're a natural lifter. It works amazingly well. DC training by Dante Trudel is another example. It is, on paper, ideal for a natural lifter. You have all the right ingredients, but it also has a huge following among steroid-using bodybuilders. Several pros use it and progress amazingly well. Good training is good training. The steroids will just increase your response to that training and decrease the chance of overtraining even more. Or you can also look at Dorian Yates, Mike Menzer, Casey Viator. Guys like that use a much lower volume approach that would be pretty effective for natural lifters, okay? That doesn't mean you don't, as an enhanced lifter, you don't want to do more volume. It means that you can train like what is optimal for natural and you will progress amazingly well. You can get away with more, doesn't mean you want to do more. Now, one of the drawbacks I see of going all in when it comes to volume and overall training stress is that it can be harder to maintain your gains or continue gaining when you go off. Because even though, okay, if you're doing 20, 25, 30 sets per muscle while on, the body still adjusts to that workload. Even though it is helped by external physiological aid, it's still adapting to a certain demand. And when you take that demand, you decrease it when you go off, well, it will be much harder to trigger new growth because the body is adapted to a certain level of workload. But if you maintain that workload, once you go natural, you certainly will actually lose muscle because you're training too much, because you will create too much muscle damage from what you can recover from naturally, and you will produce too much cortisol in a state where you already have excessive cortisol. More on that later. So that's the drawback of the high volume approach when you are enhanced, is that if you stick with that for a long time, when you go natural, it can become harder to maintain your gains and even harder to keep gaining once you go off. So ideally, an enhanced lifter would use the safe training philosophy that the natural training one would use. When I posted the first video on is there a difference between enhanced and natural lifters, some people commented that Dr. Mike Israetel, who I really like, we had several very good discussion, very good debate online, super smart guy. They pointed out that Mike said that there's no difference between our natural and enhanced lifter should train. I actually agree with Mike in that the type of training both should be doing can be the same. The only difference will be in the dosages. And Mike will agree with that because one of his book is about maximum recoverable training volume. Basically, Mike wants you to figure out what is the highest amount of volume you can tolerate and progress, and what is the lowest amount of volume you need to progress, and you find your optimal training volume from those two. Well, I'm the same opinion, meaning that a natural lifter, enhanced lifter, can use the same approach, but they can't use the same dosage of training. The enhanced lifter can get away with more. So this is my first recommendation. We just saw the first recommendation, which is natural enhanced lifters should train like natural lifters and gradually maintain, increase. So that's my second recommendation here. So you should start with a natural level training stress because it works. Natural level of training stress will work for an enhanced lifter, evidenced by the fact that fortitude training, DC training, high intensity training like Dorian Yates and Casey Viator, Mike Manzer work great for enhanced lifters too. So what you can do, because steroids will actually allow you to tolerate and recover and build from a higher training stress, is start where a natural lifter would start and gradually titrate the training set up. The key word being titrate. So it's not a huge increase. You might have a set here, a set there, very gradually, and only as needed to get more gains. It's smarter to start more conservative than go all out right away, because if you train all out when it comes to volume for a certain period of time, you can actually desensitize your body to a lower volume of training. So just start lower, and depending on how your body is reacting, you can add more and more sets. So same approach, different dosage, which is what I believe in, and I'm pretty sure that's what Dr. Israel believes in. So we are not seeing things differently. The same type of training, the same methods will work. It's the dosage that depends. That will vary, and you want to figure out what is the ideal dosage for you. But also remember that you will still need to prevent the downside, the drawbacks of training with a very, very high volume when you stop your products. The longer you spend with a very high volume of work before you go off, the harder it is to maintain your gains when you go off. Okay, recommendation number 3, don't let steroids be an excuse for not training properly. Now, of all my recommendation, this is my weakest one, but you know what? It's still worth mentioning because it surely won't affect most of you guys who spend the time to watch my video. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of steroid users are using steroids as a crutch not to have to train hard, or because they are people who naturally don't like to train hard. They didn't get results, so they figure out, well, steroids is the only way I can get results. They kind of, in their back of their mind, they don't realize, well, you know what, I can just train better, okay? So personally, I think it's a mistake of not trying to learn more about proper training. And that can be a problem, because if you're already getting lots of gains from the steroids, you might not want or desire or feel like you need to learn more about training and nutrition. And I've been around lots of bodybuilders. Some of them are amazingly smart and are like students of training and nutrition. And back in the 80s, 70s, all of these guys were. Okay? All of these guys were students of training, students of nutrition. Nowadays, you actually have plenty of bodybuilders who are all drugs. Doesn't mean necessarily they don't train hard. It means they are not interested in furthering their understanding of training. They probably don't even plan on going off the drug, so they don't figure it. I need to learn how to trigger growth naturally. So me, of course, because I'm a teacher, I always emphasize that you should try to understand what works. And using a drug that allows you to get gains more easily doesn't excuse that you should not try to learn more and more and more about optimal training. Now, not learning to train hard because you don't have to, same thing, right? The guy who never trains hard doesn't get results, so he uses steroids and he all of a sudden gets results. And also because he's taking steroids, he can do more. So don't let quantity overrun quality. That's a problem, because the steroids will allow you to recover faster. So what I see a lot of steroid users do, and that's not everybody, right? But in commercial gyms, it's rampant. You have all these guys who are on a cycle. They do endless and endless sets of pointless exercises with zero intensity, speaking on their phone almost mid-set, taking selfies, very low quality. But because the products will actually give them some gains, and because they can recover and handle more quantity, they will get some gains. But that will never be optimal, especially if you need to stop. And these guys, you will see them, actually you might not see them when they go off cycle, because they just lose their size and their ego goes down the drain. They stop training. They only train when they're using something. Anyway, So, and you also need to learn what works naturally first. The longer you can spend natural or not enhanced, I mean, if you're already using steroids, well, having periods where you don't use steroids for a significant amount of time to try to figure out what will work, what will still work naturally, is invaluable, okay? The more you understand how to gain naturally, the more you will gain enhanced. Recommendation number 4, the longer you are on, and the higher the dosages, of course, the more likely you are to lose muscle when you go off and have psychological side effects. And those psychological side effects will take a lot longer to go away if you were on for a long period of time. There was a study conducted, I have the links down in that slide, showing that the psychological side effect of steroids, I mean, the desensitization of the dopamine receptors, desensitization of the serotonin receptors, decrease in GABA, for example, these can last up to 5 and 6 times the duration of the on period. That's why you have bodybuilders who can go off cycle. They fully restore their hormonal panels. Testosterone goes back to normal. Estrogen goes back down. Everything's fine, but still zero libido, anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, no motivation. That is because those neurological issues can stay with you for 5 to 6 times the duration of your on period. If you were on for 3 months, you could have symptoms for 15 months. That's huge, okay? Now, there are ways of fixing those neurological issues, but very few people actually address that, okay? Now, the longer a cycle is, the more likely it is to lead to a cortisol rebound after the cycle. I explained this in the first video. What happens is when you are using high dosages of androgens, at the cellular level, those androgens are so fully saturating the androgen receptors that they are using most of the messengers that sends the message from the receptors to the nucleus of the cell. There's very little messengers left for cortisol to send its signal. So at the cellular level, very high level of androgens actually decrease the capacity of cortisol to do its job. So the body will react because it wants cortisol to do its job. It's important. So it will actually pump out more cortisol in response to that. But still, because you have so much androgen in your body, it likely won't make a huge difference. So the body will adapt a second strategy, which will be to increase the number, it will increase the sensitivity of the receptors, of the glucocorticoid receptors, the receptors interacting with cortisol. Now, those receptors respond more strongly, but that's normally when the gains stop or decrease during a cycle. Okay, but so people will increase their dosages, creating a bigger issue. Anyway, so, and if that still doesn't work, the body, because the cycle is longer or the dosages increase, the body will use a third strategy, which will be to increase the number of cortisol receptors. So now when you go off cycle in that situation, you have more receptors, they are more sensitive, and you're pumping out more cortisol. That is why you lose muscle. Not because you inhibited your natural testosterone production. You can actually build muscle without testosterone. Okay, that's been shown in many studies. It would be much slower, but it certainly would not lead to muscle loss. What leads to muscle loss is a cortisol issue. Your cortisol system is way upregulated. Now, that's why you want those longer, the longer you are on and the higher your dosages, the more likely you are to elevate that cortisol system, okay? So shorter cycle, lower dosages, we will cover that later in a video, are much less likely to lead to that cortisol rebound leading to muscle loss, okay? Now, because steroids can directly stimulate the dopaminergic and serotoninergic receptors, okay, those receptors can be made resistant because they are overstimulated. And when you go off, you no longer have that stimulation, And now your receptors are so desensitized that they don't respond to your normal output of dopamine and serotonin. Essentially, you become very low dopamine activity, very low serotonin activity. That leads to things like decrease in motivation, decrease in pleasure response, apathy, no motivation, as I mentioned, even depression, problems adapting to different situations, anxiety, problems sleeping, depression. So all kinds of bad things, right? Drop in libido also. So when you go off, it will take time to resensitize those receptors. And as I mentioned, it can be as long as 5 to 6 times as long as the on period was. And also some steroids like equipoise, for example, can lower GABA. And when GABA is low, anxiety goes up. Okay, GABA and serotonin are the two main neurotransmitters that helps you deal with anxiety. And anxiety is nothing more than your brain firing too fast, out of control. That's all it is. So if GABA is low and now you're resistant to serotonin, you have nothing to calm the brain down when it gets excited. That leads to anxiety. That can lead to paranoia. That can lead to problems sleeping. Okay. That all kinds of bad things. And sadly, it actually leads to an even greater cortisol response, compounding the problem, okay? Nobody fixes neurological problems, and that is, in my opinion, the number one issues with steroids. Now, unless you're a pro, you should, because of what I just mentioned, and many of you won't like hearing what I'm saying, you should include as much time on as time off as time on. And that's been a recommendation that's been around for years, yet very few people use it. People used to live by that in the 70s, 80s, even some of the guys in the 90s. Pros couldn't afford to do that because they needed to stay in shape for guest posing and stuff like that. But nowadays, it seems like everybody who's using steroids stays on all the time. Maybe because of psychological addiction, maybe because they need to stay in shape for their Instagram account, whatever, okay? But you don't see the time on, same time off as time on approach anymore. But if you want to stay happy and progress for longer, to me, it's actually a must, right? And again, it's because the longer you stay on, the more issues you have when you stay off. And eventually you might be forced to stay off, and that will lead to issues, okay? So psychological addiction is real, okay? Because you strongly stimulate the pleasure center of your brain, and also the zone of your brain that allows you to feel good, serotonin and dopamine. So once you don't have that stimulation anymore, you will be in the same state as a drug addict who stopped using drugs. So there's a real psychological addiction. And the longer you are on, the more likely you are to become addicted, okay? Psychological side effects like anxiety, drop in motivation, decrease in sexual desire, anhedonia, which is lack of pleasure, nothing is fun anymore, apathy, drop in self-esteem are all side effects of being on for too long by desensitizing those receptors in your brain. Obviously, the longer you are on, the more likely you are to lose muscle when you go off. Shorter periods of on and off are decrease the likeliness of muscle loss, because the muscle loss will come from not the inhibition of testosterone, although that doesn't make it easier. It's the overproduction, the overcompensation of the cortisol system. And the longer you are on, the higher your dosages are, the more likely you are to develop that and have that huge rebound at the end of your cycle. That's why a lot of people will use the blast and cruise approach, which I will talk about in a moment. Now, cardiovascular issues, kidney issues are also quite common with steroids. But one of the main reasons is ignored by most people. The reason is because the increase in blood pressure. Probably the worst thing, physiologically speaking, not neurologically speaking, that can come from steroids is the increase in blood pressure. And they don't call it the silent killer for nothing. It can lead to cardiovascular issues. It can lead to an enlarged heart. It can lead to kidney issues, kidney problem, kidney damage, and that can be long-lasting or even life-threatening. Okay, now what people steroids will increase blood pressure by two mechanisms. The first mechanism is the one that is the most well known. It's the water retention. Okay, so the more water retention you have, the higher the blood pressure. That's why when you have very, very high blood pressure, they give you diuretics, because when you flush out that water, blood pressure goes down. So that's the first and well-known reason. So of course, the steroids that lead to higher water retention will cause the most blood pressure increase. Of course, it's not made easier by the bulking at all cost approach, which by itself will increase blood pressure. When combined with steroids leading to water retention, you balloon up, good luck. Okay, but the second reason why steroids can increase blood pressure is because they increase the sensitivity of the beta adrenergic receptors. So basically, you are more responsive to adrenaline. And that's another reason why some steroids are good to make you drop fat or cut. Like Trenbolone is well known for helping you lose fat. Well, it's because it's a very, very strong stimulus for increase in beta adrenergic sensitivity. And that's why Trenbolone can make you an unhappy person, quote unquote, roid rage. Okay. The main reason is that Trenbolone increases your response to adrenaline quite a bit. That makes you more competitive, more aggressive, less patient, among things. Because adrenaline is basically the fight or flight hormone or neurotransmitter. So it wants to make you more fight-like. Okay. So by increasing that adrenaline sensitivity, that activity, Trenbolone and other high androgens can make you lose fat more easily. But also, it can increase blood pressure. The higher your adrenaline is, the higher your heart rate is, the more strongly your heart contracts, sending more blood into the blood vessel, increasing blood pressure. So that's one of the reasons why being on for such a long time can be detrimental. Even if you take steps to lowering adrenaline or lowering blood pressure, it can still stay high even if you decrease water retention because of the adrenergic stimulation. That's why personally, I think that Trenbolone is one of the worst product that people can use, and I would only recommend it for competitive bodybuilders for the last few weeks of a contest, or a power lifter. It's actually not a very good drug to build muscle, stimulate growth. It's more of an anti-catabolic, and it dramatically increases the look you have by acting as a mild diuretic. So you lose water, making you look harder, and it increase muscle tone, because the more you are sensitive to adrenaline, the harder your muscles will be. So Trenbolone is very, very high stimulus of adrenaline sensitivity, will make the muscle look hard, and will also make you drop water and help you lose fat. So it can change your body visually instantly, but it doesn't build muscle that well. So if you are someone training in a gym just to look better, that is literally the worst product you can take, because it has the highest incidence of side effect. It's probably the only product that will directly negatively impact kidneys, for example. All right. Now, the less time you can spend on in any given period, the less likely to have those issues. Okay. So if you would stay on, for example, when you're using like Brian Batchelder's old approach. Brian Batchelder used to work with powerlifters, Olympic weightlifters, track and field athlete in the UK, and some bodybuilders also. And he was known for using very short cycle, using short acting compounds for 2 or 3 weeks on, 2 or 3 weeks off, and on and on and on and on like that. And that short period, of course, you don't gain as much. But those short period, you basically lose nothing. During the off period, you can actually keep gaining. You have no psychological side effect. You have no shutdown. You have no cortisol rebound. Okay. But people are impatient, so they don't like that approach, because they don't suddenly gain 30 pounds in a month and a half of bloated water retention. Anyway, now the issues with the blast and cruise approach that I briefly mentioned earlier, and it's quite popular in bodybuilding cycle because bodybuilders are afraid of being off. So they will use a very high or moderate dosages for their cycle, then their off period is like 200 milligrams of testosterone only. But that does not fix the problem. It does not fix the cortisol issue. It doesn't fix the receptor sensitivity issue. In fact, it just keeps desensitizing those receptors even more. You never give your brain chemistry chance to adapt. So it's a Band-Aid. It gives you the illusion that you are counteracting the potential side effect because you are using baby doses for a few weeks. But in reality, you are just delaying the inevitable. And the longer you are on, because a cruise period is an on period, the longer on you are, the more of these issues you're going to have. We just saw the potential side effects of using steroids, not only on muscle loss because of the cortisol rebound, but also on psychological issues because of the impact on several neurotransmitter systems. Okay. Now, those, and also talked about you need to be off as often or more as you are on. Now, one thing I also see bodybuilders doing that is something that is so simple to avoid, yet most people don't do it, and it can actually save them a lot of gains, is the last 1 or 2 weeks of your cycle. You should actually spend those weeks trying to lower cortisol as much as possible. It is a mistake to wait the beginning of your off period to try to lower cortisol, because now you're trying to stop the gap or fix the gap in a dam and trying to prevent the water from running out when the breach is way too big to fix and you have very little potty to fix it. Okay, you need to try to fix that breach before it gets too big, and while you have lots of tools available to fix that breach. Okay, so the worst thing you can have during an off period is a high cortisol level when you start that off period. So you want to use those last 2 weeks of an on cycle to bring cortisol down as much as possible, so that when you start your off period, you're less likely to rebound. So first, you need to lower training stress. So basically, you go back to what a natural lifter would do, maybe even lower training stress those last 2 weeks. And because you're on drugs, you will still progress, so don't worry about that. But you need to do everything you can to lower cortisol. You should have more off days during those last 2 weeks. Again, those off days allow you to decrease cortisol output that are due to training. You want a higher carbohydrate intake. People always ask me, what is the best supplement to lower cortisol? It's carbohydrates. Carbohydrates have, and it's well documented. Carbohydrates can decrease cortisol during training, for example, okay? Because one of the functions of cortisol is 1, to mobilize stored energy, and 2, to maintain blood sugar level if it drops down too low. If you're consuming carbohydrates, there's less of a need to release cortisol during your day. Now, be careful. If you overdo it, consuming way too many carbohydrates, it could have the opposite effect. Because now the body will produce too much insulin, dropping blood sugar way down. So you still want to have good carbs. When I say more carbohydrates, it's not a license to eat donuts, even though I would like to tell you that. So it should be those more complex carbohydrates, high fiber carbohydrates, to maintain a more stable blood sugar level. The more stable the blood sugar level is during your day, the lower cortisol output will be. Very simple anti-cortisol strategy, very inexpensive. Consuming glycine post-workout and in the evening. 3 to 7 grams post-workout, 3 to 7 grams in the evening. Glycine is probably the best oral supplement you can use. It's a neurological inhibitor. It does a lot of what GABA and serotonin do. It calms the brain down, which decreases cortisol, decreases adrenaline. It also will increase serotonin level, which is a benefit when you want to bring that up to compensate for the desensitization that you might have caused during your cycle. Also, it increased mTOR activation, so protein synthesis. So in your natural period, that's why I like to have glycine in, because it further increased protein synthesis after a session. So we would go normally with 3 to 7 grams. Start lower to see what your tolerance is. Then I would use phosphatidylserine, 600 to 800 milligrams. That can actually be taken before your workout, because phosphatidylserine is a cortisol modulator. It's not a cortisol decreaser. If cortisol becomes too high, it brings it down. If it's too low, it brings it up. It basically helps you keep optimal cortisol levels. Magnesium works by dislocating the adrenaline from its receptor, decreasing the risk of burning out those beta adrenergic receptors. I would go with either taurate or glycinate. You don't have to use glycinate if you are already using glycine, of course, because you will already have plenty of glycine. So you would take 2 to 3 times during your day between 250 and 500 milligrams of magnesium, taurate, or glycinate. One would be post-workout, one would be in the evening, the third one could be before going to bed. Magnesium is better absorbed in smaller, more frequent dosages than one big bolus dose. By the way, I do recommend keeping those strategies on during the early off-cycle period. So the first 3 or 4 weeks of an off period is the worst possible time to get leaner. And we see that all the time, right? I can't get like super jacked. At least I'll be ripped. And how many people do that? No, just no. It's the recipe to lose muscle mass. You can't go on a caloric deficit when you start your off cycle. Your cortisol is already high. The more of a deficit you have, the less carbs you have, the more cortisol you will produce. So if you go off cycle, your goal is to lower cortisol back down as quickly as possible, because that is what causes the muscle loss. Furthermore, when you lower down calories, especially lower down carbohydrates, serotonin will also go down. In fact, the lower carbs you go, the lower serotonin you have. Remember, after your cycle, you will have serotonin issues because you made your receptors resistant. So you want to improve the system as fast as possible. So the last thing you want is cut calories, cut carbs post-cycle. In fact, you want to eat a surplus. Yeah, but I'm going to get fat and I'm going to lose muscle. Yeah, but you know what? It's something you have to do if you want to maintain as much muscle as you want, okay? It might make you look worse for a month and a half, 2 months, but if it allows you to become healthy and maintain more of that muscle and being able to regain the capacity to build muscle naturally quicker, that's a big benefit. Stop being so short-sighted. I need to look jacked at all times, okay? You see it on the long term. So the last thing you want, as I reiterate, being a deficit during the cortisol period. Also, you want to maintain the cortisol-lowering strategies I mentioned in the previous recommendation. Any little bit can help. Lower cortisol as much as possible. It's your number one goal for the early off-cycle period. Finally, pre- and intra-workout carbs, and also ideally with protein or amino acids, although full protein are better, are even more important during that period. Again, to decrease the excessive cortisol response from training. You want to use every tool at your disposal to lower cortisol as much as possible during that crucial period. Finally, during your off period, you very well may have a lower tolerance to training stress than natural lifters. So you want to use even less overall training stress. Okay, most people lose muscle when they go off, oftentimes because they are afraid of losing muscle. They're afraid of losing muscle, so they increase the volume they're doing. Why? 2 reasons. First, the fear of losing muscle. Second, when you go off cycle, your pumps will disappear. That is especially true if you use a product that led to an increase in water retention and just those nasty pumps, Ditabol, for example, Anadrol, for example. You go off, and you know what? You are not getting those pumps anymore. And at rest, you feel a lot flatter, okay? So that psychologically, you're chasing that pump in a gym. And chasing that pump leads to more volume, which leads to more cortisol, which leads to more muscle damage. And you can't recover from that because at that point, you are worse off than a natural lifter. Okay? So it's really time to focus on training economy, doing the most with the least. 3 days a week, very low volume, but high intensiveness. But really, don't preach by trying to chase that pump. It won't be at the same as when you're on cycle. And any strategies that will give you that pump will actually make it more likely that you will lose muscle during your off period. So I hope that those recommendations can be of help of those of you who decide to go that route, okay? Again, it's not a video to recommend steroids. I've never actually recommended. In fact, I refuse clients who take steroids. So I'm not against them, but I personally decide not to work with those clients anymore. But still, I do have knowledge that will help you who choose that route to avoid the potential side effect, the potential issues, the psychological addiction, and the rented muscle philosophy. If you want to keep that muscle, if you want to keep feeling good, apply the recommendations I've given you in that video. I hope you enjoyed it. So I hope to see you next time. If you have any comments, questions, or insults, post them in the comments down below. I will try to answer everybody to the best of my knowledge. Hit that bell button if you want to be noticed when I'm producing more videos. I'm filming more and more of them, so I will keep the content coming. So be sure to click that bell not to miss anything out. So see you guys on the next video.